We're now in front of the Great Sphinx, one of the most iconic monuments in the world. And of course, the enigma is, how old is it? And there's a lot of different points which give us clues, at least.
So I'm just standing now by the paws of the Sphinx on the Giza Plateau. Now, it's said that this was like the guardian lion of the Giza Plateau, but there is evidence that this could well have been Anubis, the sort of jackal dog, the ancient god of Egypt. There's even talk of a second Sphinx as well, which once existed here, which has now been completely kind of worn down.
One of the enigmas associated with the Sphinx is, of course, the weathering. And this is something that the late John Anthony West pointed out and obviously was followed on with the work of Boston geologist Robert Schoch. And this is whether the weathering that we see on the edges of the Sphinx enclosure was actually done by wind, perhaps by salt in the actual sand that would have surrounded it at many points during its history, or whether it might actually have been done by rain precipitation, in other words, rain pouring over the edge of the plateau. And this is what you can see here right at the back, and I think that that is correct. I think that Robert Schoch and John Anthony West were absolutely correct with their evaluations. And there is a British geologist by the name of Colin Reeder who also came to the same conclusion. The big question mark becomes, how old is this weathering? Does it actually show that the Sphinx enclosure was in place many thousands of years before the time of the pharaohs, which is what some researchers suggest, or could this rain precipitation have occurred during dynastic times? And there are a number of accounts of flash floods and storms existing during the dynastic period.
But you can clearly see, if you just look behind me here, you can clearly see the weathering within the Sphinx enclosure, which is work that was done by Robert Schoch, who suggests that the water here, the geology combined with the weather at the time, dates it back to at least 10,500 BC, which is fascinating because this is the time that the Sphinx was oriented to Leo, facing east, the Leo constellation, during that particular epoch.
Okay, well, you know, here you can definitely see the water erosion. It's very significant, you know, it's very deep fissures. And the erosion on top there on the Sphinx is very significant as well, right above the repair blocks. This is probably why even the dynastic Egypt said, oh, we gotta repair this, it's falling apart.
The head and the back of the Sphinx would have been visible for many thousands of years prior to the Pyramid Age itself. But it may not have actually been carved. The actual head may well have been a simulacra of an animal associated maybe with animistic rites, shamanistic rites. What type of animal? Well, most obviously it was a large cat, maybe a lion or a panther, but it could equally have been, as Robert Temple has proposed, that of a canine.
And it was in fact an Anubis dog, like a jackal dog, who was a guardian of the mysteries. And the back is too flat for a feline. The paws are recarved later, and there's no real evidence of any kind of leonine figures that would hold such a prestigious place in ancient Rosto, which was the old name of Giza.
Perhaps more likely a wolf. And the reason why I say a wolf is because there are a lot of very early written traditions relating to a wolf, occasionally known as Wepwarat, basically the opener of the ways, being the psychopomp, the guide of the soul being carried through the underworld into the afterlife itself. But at the same time, you also have stories of a lion, or a twin lion known as the Ruti, R-U-T-I, which also guards the entrances into the underworld. So it could have been a lion or a big cat of some kind, or it could have been a canine, perhaps even a wolf.
And even the Sphinx Temple is amazing, with huge limestone blocks, some of the largest in the world. And it had a granite casing as well within it, like we find on the Valley Temple next door. Didn't realise that before, so this suggests that these go back very, very long time, and this was even completely covered with sand until like just under 100 years ago. So absolutely amazing to be right next to the Sphinx itself.
And we can see the huge blocks already, massive megalithic blocks, many tons in weight, 50 tons, some of them you'll see are 100 tons, perhaps even 200 tons. Which leads to the immediate question of why would you want to use blocks that size? Why not use much smaller blocks or even mud bricks? I mean, obviously that's an enigma that people have been trying to solve for decades, but it's something worth pondering upon again.
So not only is these 200-ton blocks available, placed in here to make the walls, but the 200-ton block were cased inside and outside with massive granite blocks from Aswan, right? That comes from 600 kilometers.
So Yousef's just pointing out the magnitude of some of this limestone here. Some of them 130 tons, possibly even more, different estimations. And the beautiful granite casing stones all around the edge. And according to Robert Temple, this is not only older than the Valley Temple, potentially older than the Sphinx. It's actually could go back to pre-dynastic times, whereas the Valley Temple was probably early dynastic times. And so it's great to be able to get a view of it here. But I'm standing on the western wall of the Sphinx Temple. There really should be a way through here to the Sphinx if it's connected with the Sphinx. There is a theory it's not, it's completely separate.
Now imagine if you're removing stones, and you can tell from the layering, but if you're removing stones from the bedrock, why wouldn't you remove manageable stones, right? In this case, you're removing 200-ton blocks at a time. Look at this guy, this stone on the bottom there, for instance. You can see the layering in the stone. So you could find probably a place, or the one beside it, you see the layering there? You can probably find a place where that layering matches the layering that you see on the back wall, right?
Well, one of the engineering challenges is the tight quarters, that there's not a lot of room to work in this area to set these massive stones. Because that's one of the arguments, you spread it out, you have ramps, or, it was very tight quarters. And what would you say about the weight of some of these stones, 150 tons?
Some of them reaches until 130 tons according to the academic story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So completely massive, stacked up stones.
It's probably one of the oldest archaeology work that happened here around the Sphinx. Because at the time of Thutmose IV, the Sphinx was buried. And according to the story that is mentioned in the stela, he was here one day hunting, and he saw a vision or a dream, that's why it's called a dream stela, that the great God is talking to him, and he told him, look at me, my son, I'm choking, the sand is like burying me, and then told him, like, if you reveal the sand around me, you will be the successor of the throne. And this is, of course, what the priest wrote here to give the power to Tutmosis IV to be the successor of the throne. So they, but the archaeology work was done, and the evidence that is these mud brick walls that you will see over there. These are actually from 1500 BC, because some of the bricks had the stamp of Tutmosis IV on it. Also, there used to be many steles here, and they had like ears on him and images of the Sphinx. The oldest steles from limestone had the images of the Sphinx seated on a pedestal, and the pedestal was as high as the Sphinx itself. So it's probably lower than this bedrock on the other side. Not many people mentioned. So even during the time of Tutmosis, he didn't reach all the way to that pedestal. The importance of that is coming, of course, with the mysteries around the chamber that can be existing beneath or underneath the Sphinx itself. Words were said by the locals when excavation happened here during the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, that they saw a gateway going to underneath the Sphinx. And some said it's a huge chamber. Some people said there is a passage that link between the Sphinx and the middle pyramid, all the way underneath. Strange enough, the work of GPR that was created by Dr. Robert Chuck, which I had, of course, the honor of being here with him more than once. Actually, he shared with us that he did found that there is a passage running underneath the left paw of the Sphinx, and this is according to the GPR. But of course, the high priest of his days said to him, it's a natural crack. Yet we know that there is another one. We're going to see it in the back left paw of the Sphinx.
This is behind the stela. There's a tunnel that goes down. There's a photograph of Zawi Hawass coming out of it, or some video, I believe. I don't know how long it is, but I'm just going to, you can't get in there, so I'm going to just poke my head in around back. Yeah, right there you can see tunnel that goes down. You know, there is a notion that there's an extensive series of tunnels and passageways underneath the whole Giza Plateau. Let me get down here. This might be an example right there, back of the stela, and the tunnel that goes down. Here's one of the entrances, like a shaft in the back of the Sphinx. You can't go down there. I'm not advocating anybody does, but it's another interesting little section here. The idea is that there's a massive complex underneath the Giza Plateau. Oh, watch out. And the most interesting thing, I think it's in Bauval and Hancock's book, is that out in front of the Sphinx, there was drill testing that occurred in the 90s, but they hit granite, which there's no granite here. And then it was, I think Zawi Hawass did the test, or Lerner, and they hit granite like 20 or 30 feet down or 40 feet down. I think out in front of the Sphinx, and what that entails is, or what that reveals, is that there's a structure below, because there's no granite here. It's down in Aswan and other places. So this is all limestone bedrock. So that's what intrigues me the most. That to me is the most compelling piece of evidence. They did an actual borehole in the 90s and ran into granite.
The causeway, which comes down from the second pyramid, abuts the actual Sphinx enclosure itself. Now, what that means is that the rock and blocks that were taken out of there and used to create the Sphinx Temple to my left here must have been in place before the Sphinx was quarried out. So let's just make that clear. The causeway is older than the actual enclosure itself because the two abut that. And just to the north, sorry, to the west of the backside of the Sphinx is another quarry, and the blocks that came out of that were used to construct the Great Pyramid because various gangs of that were doing the quarrying, the masons at the time have actually left their mark. So we know that the blocks from there were used to create the Great Pyramid. So what we're saying here is that the causeway is older than all of these. It's older than the Great Pyramid. It's older than the quarrying to create the Sphinx enclosure. And this is something that begins to suggest that the second pyramid is actually older, or certainly the location of it, than the Great Pyramid itself. You say, well, how can that be? The person that supposedly constructed the Great Pyramid was Khufu. He lived around 2600 BC. Khafre, who is behind the construction of the second pyramid, came about 50 years later, maybe 2550 BC. But it's my belief that the second pyramid and the causeway predate the Great Pyramid and predate the Sphinx enclosure.
The Edgar Cayce story, first of all, is that there's a Hall of Records under the right part of the Sphinx, which is interesting because it lines up with Robert Vival and Graham Hancock's dates of the astronomical alignments of the Great Pyramid, 10,500 BC, 10,400 BC. So Robert Schoch and Thomas DeBecke did GPR, like a geophysical survey here, and there are karst features which are natural in the earth. But what they found was like I think a 40-meter long chamber with something in it. That's what Robert Schoch said. And right now they're working to get permits to put like a fiber optic scope in there to see as the first step. And Manu, his name escapes me, Savadesh, I think, is working with Robert. They wrote a paper together with Boval last year about the hieroglyphic evidence for a lost Hall of Records. It's really interesting. So it seems to be moving in that direction. There's a new antiquities minister, seems to be a little more progressive. But I think it's like over there, not too far, that this Hall of Records is supposed to be. That's what Cayce said. He also said there's one probably under Piedras Negras in the Yucatan that was buried there. Sounds like a sci-fi movie, but we see how complex the Mayan civilization is, building pyramids, all the information that was destroyed in the codices would reveal in civilization somewhat equal to this. And the similarities on both sides of the Atlantic we've shown many times throughout in this tour. But I just find it really intriguing that a lot is lining up with this Lost Hall of Records being here, and I just feel compelled to keep digging in this direction. And I think we want to find the answers one way or the other. So if there's a secret void in the pyramid or there's a chamber here, one of these times we're going to hit a Hall of Records of some sort to give us a full accounting of all the ages in Egypt. Whether they're conventional or non-conventional, that's not really the point. It's that let objective science take over, not petty political games and egocentric nonsense. Just we all want to know the answers, and it'd be, I would assume, great for Egyptian tourism. So I keep following that story about Schoch and the investigations here.
For some reason, the workers during Napoleon time, they were forced to stop working when they found the entrance of that gate. So this is, of course, part of the mystery. Some academics believe it could exist. Some say no, these were exaggeration by the locals. so they can get some bakshish from the French. You know what I mean? Some tipping from the French, I would like to. But let me tell you, as a local, the good thing about like having my house right straight from here, we see everything that happens here. A lot of it is not mentioned, and that's all I have to say about that.
You know, I get a sense that this was something else. It wasn't what we see today. Clearly the head's been changed, possibly in the Old Kingdom, which is interesting, but the Sphinx Temple is extremely ancient. Also we have the Valley Temple, and we have the weathering, and we have possible chambers underneath here. So it's a real treat to be here. We always come here on our Megalithomania tours, and behind me here you can see like the weathering all over around the enclosure that the Sphinx sits within. That was all carved out. All the stone that was from here was taken and used in the Valley Temple and in the Sphinx Temple. And so they kind of worked this deliberately. It was very important to them for some reason.
But the Sphinx itself was constructed from a natural knoll or promontory, which is known to have been venerated possibly for thousands of years before the time of the pharaohs. Different burials have been found in the area of the Sphinx going back at least to 3500 BC and possibly even older than that, and they belong to what is known as the Mahdi culture. Almost certainly there was activity on the plateau much earlier than this, going back many thousands of years. But what this does suggest, and there is an Egyptologist, lady by the name of Serena Love, who's done a lot of work on the Sphinx and the Sphinx promontory to suggest that this was a monument of veneration in its natural form with some kind of simulacra, most likely, you know, maybe that of a lion or perhaps that of a dog or a wolf, that went back many thousands of years. And that could be one of the reasons why this whole area became associated with the death and rebirth, not just of the pharaoh but of the sun. Remember that the Sphinx promontory is orientated east-west. Now that's exactly the sun at the time of the equinoxes. And so what this would suggest is that when the sun set in the west, it went underneath the plateau and underneath the Sphinx promontory and rose up again in the east. Which brings in the whole idea that there may be some kind of underworld or cave world existing at Giza, something that we now know because myself and Egyptological researcher Nigel Skinner-Simpson refound this cave world back in 2008. But there is also a clue in the name of Giza itself during dynastic times, and that's Rostau. Now Rostau means the mouth of the passages or the mouth of the entrances into what were most likely caves. And I think that this is one of the reasons why the actual monuments at Giza were constructed in the first place, because there was a belief that the pharaoh had to first go through the underworld before he could rise up at dawn into the skies, into the eastern skies, and link with the constellation of Orion before moving towards the north, which is what the pyramid texts tell us, to the final destination of the soul, somewhere in the northern sky.
And so this location as well was very important, because underneath the Great Pyramid, which is just behind the Sphinx over there, we have the primordial mound, which would have been like the Zep Tepi, like the foundation, the origin point of this great ancient culture. And the Sphinx, everything else on the Giza Plateau throughout Egypt was part of this. And I believe it was actually built, you know, the Sphinx at least, the Sphinx Temple, Valley Temple, possibly the foundations, the beginning of the pyramids, by the followers of Horus, these great people who were here before the first pharaohs. You know, they were here after the reign of the gods. They were like semi-divine beings or demigods. And they may have been responsible for this because they were thought to be master builders. And so the evidence is all around us. It's just trying to work out what exactly was going on here in prehistory.